Bore da, chroeso, a rhan cyswllt Amgylchedd Cymru i'r hystingau natur. Welcome to the 2021 Nature Hustings for the Senedd elections, hosted by Wales Environment Link, or WEL for short. I'm Roger Thomas, Chair of WEL, and I'll shortly hand over to Carol Green, Work and Economy Correspondent of ITV Wales, who will preside over this event. But first, a little about WEL. We're a network of over 30 conservation charities working together since 1990, since in fact the dawn of devolution. This year we're facing the first election to the Welsh Parliament, renamed of course to reflect the extent to which powers are now devolved to Wales, and the first time that young people from 16 years old can have a say in who runs Wales. In 2019, a YouGov poll showed 45% of 18 to 24-year-olds describe the environment as one of the nation's most pressing concerns, making it their second biggest issue behind Brexit. We hope that this hustings gives an insight as to how the next Welsh Government will prioritise, restore and rejuvenate our environment. WEL's member organisations enjoy extensive support from the Welsh electorate, from people who care enough to fund their work to save our birds, our bugs and our pollinators, to protect our precious landscapes and our seas. Support from people who understand the inescapable need to turn back the tide of the nature and climate crises before it's too late. The WEL network collectively represents over 420,000 people. That's 13% of the population of Wales, more than any political party. Our member organisations also own or manage 5% of the land area of Wales, as well as advising on land and marine management across Wales. The questions facing the party representatives today are drawn from the WEL Manifesto, which you can read online at www.waleslink.org/manifesto2021. They're what the WEL network considers to be the best way to reverse the nature crisis. We'll be covering a breadth of issues from managing our land, replacing biodiversity targets, our precious seas, plastic pollution, through to closing the Brexit governance gap for environmental protection. You might wonder why our questions seem more about nature than climate change. Whilst carbon emissions are a long-standing problem that we urgently need to address more comprehensively, not everything we do in tackling climate change is good for the nature crisis, good for the species going extinct and the habitats being lost. But the things we do for nature do also tend to be good for carbon emissions. Nature is a natural carbon store. As we emerge from a global pandemic, with both an opportunity to do things differently and a new appreciation of our green spaces, placing nature at the heart of all our policies will enable us to tackle both the climate and nature crises as one, nature-based solutions. In Wales, we can't control emissions from other countries, but we can control and capture our emissions, we can restore our degraded habitats, and we can save our species, thereby setting an example to other countries on how to protect their environments. But that's enough from me. You want to hear from the candidates. So it's a great pleasure now to hand over to Carol Green.
Diolch, bore da pawb, good morning and welcome to this morning's hustings hosted by WEL. I'd like to introduce you to our panel. Basically, our panel have been invited on the basis that they are from parties that have been polled to win a seat in the Senedd elections. So if I start with Leslie Griffiths, who you will know as the Welsh Labour representative and the Minister for Environment, Energy and Rural Affairs. Welcome, Leslie. Leslie will have to swap out halfway through. She apologises for that, but it's a busy day and will be replaced by John Griffiths, who many of you will know for chairing the cross-party group for biodiversity in the Senedd. So those are the Labour representatives, and then for the Conservatives we have Janet Finch Saunders. Now, Janice, as you will know, is the representative for Aberconwy. Very importantly this morning, she sends her apologies for being a little bit late. She's having her jab, so we wish her all the well for that, but will join us very soon. Lleir Griffith is the Plaid Cymru representative, and as you will know, is the party's spokesperson on environment and rural affairs. Caroline Jones joins us from the Independent Alliance from Reform Party, and Anthony Slaughter is the representative from the Wales Green Party. And Councillor Rodney Berman, we welcome you from the Welsh Liberal Democrats. Many of you will know Rodney. He acts as the environment spokesperson for the party, and basically is very active in his local community in Cardiff. So welcome to you all. We'll get underway. I'm sure Janet will join us as soon as she can. But I would like to start, basically, I'd like to start with farming, a big issue, a very knotty issue to unpack. And I think that's where we should begin. First of all, I'd like to go to Lesley Griffiths, the Minister for the Environment, because basically Labour have set out what you would do to replace the Common Agricultural Policy. And I think that's the first thing we'd like to address. What does this new Welsh farming system look like from the Labour perspective?
Thank you very much, Carol, and thank you for the invitation to take part today. You're right, we have set out our stall. We're just coming to the end, actually, of the third consultation. And, if one thing I think we all recognise is that CAP hasn't given us an agricultural sector that we would want, and it is an opportunity to have that bespoke Welsh policy. So I think the mantra has certainly been, public money for public goods. And I think that is one useful way of thinking about it, but it doesn't really capture the full extent of what I believe is needed. It's about scale and pace. So our first challenge, of course, is the climate and nature emergency, and farmers absolutely are part of the solution to that. So what our new system of farm support has to do is drive action at the scale that's needed if we are indeed going to meet our net zero ambition. So that means we can't really afford just to tinker around at the edges. We've got to have a new system of farming support to deliver public goods, but critically, it's got to be consistent with our path to net zero. So that means we need faster emissions reduction than we've seen to date. And the agricultural pollution regulations we've put in place are really an important part of setting a stronger regulatory baseline. And whilst implementing them on the farm will produce public goods in terms of cleaner air and rivers, and farm subsidy payments need to be for farmers to go even further in reducing emissions. So paying farmers to meet the regulatory baseline, or simply continuing just to pay farmers on the basis of the amount of land they farm, as some are suggesting, might give us some level of public goods, but nowhere near enough. Similarly, farmers do a huge amount already to protect habitats, and whilst we want to see that kind of public good continue, we need a system of farm support which will get absolutely everybody protecting habitats on their farms if we're going to reverse that decline. And of course, if they're doing it currently, they're not getting rewarded for that. So public goods, yes, but scale and pace is absolutely critical. Secondly, we've a much more challenging trading environment for farming now we've left the European Union. So a new system of farm support needs to secure Wales's reputation for having the most climate and nature-friendly farming sector in the world. And this will allow us to capture more domestic and international demand for our produce based on those high environmental and welfare standards. So as well as public goods, those sustainability credentials have to be world leading so the sector can thrive economically as well. So much more than public goods. And I do think with the right support, the agricultural farming sector can absolutely do that. Thank you.
But there's the rub, isn't it? The right support, because you can't do any of that without the buy-in of the farming community. And so far, it's, these initiatives have not been welcomed.
Sorry, you come back to me. Sorry. I thought I muted, sorry. Well, if you're talking about the agricultural pollution, I think it's, it's certainly been very mixed. I've had lots of farmers contact me to say, absolutely, this is the way forward. I think, we've got to be ambitious. And certainly the consultations that we've done, as I say, we're coming to the end of the third one now. I think if you look at them, every time we've brought a consultation forward, they've reflected on the previous consultation, the responses in. So I think there's been excellent buy-in from the sector there. But of course, people don't like being told what to do, and that's why we had a voluntary sector initially. But I think it's absolutely vital. Those agricultural pollution regulations bring about the change we need in reducing the number of agricultural pollution incidents that we've seen, unfortunately, over the past 2 decades, particularly.
Diolch, Leslie. Councillor Berman, would you support a system prioritising payments for public goods? And could you give us some examples of public goods from a Liberal Democratic perspective, please?
Sorry, I just realised I'd forgotten to take myself off mute there. Well, this is an interesting and challenging question for a city dweller like myself, who's standing in the one constituency, I think, in Wales that doesn't have any farms in it. But I'll nonetheless give it a go because it's a very important topic. Essentially, what the Welsh Liberal Democrats believe is that the basic payment system needs to be replaced by a system that's based on public money for public goods. We certainly fully accept that. And that's got to include sustainable land management for biodiversity gain so that we meet our climate change obligations. And it's also got to include improvements in water quality and tackling pollution. And we should also consider quality food production as a public good in how we issue these payments. But the transition from the basic payment scheme to the sustainable farming scheme does need to be managed carefully. And we must ensure that no farmer is left without financial support during the process to avoid a shock to the rural economy. I mean, you wouldn't be wanting to make this transition at this time if you had the choice, would you? Because, we're coming out of a scenario where we're dealing with the shocks to the economy from COVID, and we've got to, adapt to a situation the Welsh Liberal Democrats never wanted to be in, where we have, come out of the EU and we're having to look at how the system is reformed. So that's why, we've got to do so in a way that does actually bring the farming sector with us. Now, our proposed sustainable farming payment will be available both for maintenance and creation. So, for instance, if a farmer already manages an area of semi-natural habitat, the sustainable farming payment can pay for this to continue. And if a farmer wishes to create a new area of semi-natural habitat, the payments can be made to reward the farmer for delivering that as well. So payment for the protection of existing semi-natural habitats, especially the best bits, we think should be the priority. And those should be fast-tracked into the scheme. And we should also be supporting things like organic vegetable production, so that we give sectors like that appropriate priority and support. And we'd also like to see us move towards holdings of all sizes to be included in the scheme, because I understand currently it's only those just above 5 hectares that are included. So looking at the scope for broadening that out would also be something that we would support.
Thank you, Rodney. Llyr Griffiths for Plaid Cymru. This is a knotty issue for you, isn't it, given the areas where you traditionally draw your support, particularly on the question of food production, public good or not. And I guess that also depends on the how we produce. So if you could give us your thoughts, please.
I'm sure it's a knotty issue. I think, where we want to get to isn't dissimilar to where the government and others believe we should be. I think the question here is how we get there, and I think it's the route map as opposed to the destination. And, I support payment for public goods. We've been talking in Wales about payment for ecosystem services for a decade and more, and in a broader sense, that's where we want to get to. But, we haven't seen probably the advancements we'd like to see, but we know, that the challenges facing society and the agricultural sector means that we do need to forge a new context for agriculture in Wales. And, that has to happen in a way that puts the resilience of our family farms at the heart of the industry's renaissance. But you can't do that without recognising that the economic future of farming is inextricably linked to the prospects of nature and of the environment. Now, our current trajectory leaves us, with increasingly less sustainable farms, which ultimately might leave us with fewer farms, larger farms, and those farms will be dependent on intensive, high input, nature poor business models. So we have to avoid that scenario, and recasting our farm support system to this sort of post-COVID, post-Brexit era is our opportunity to do that. But I would say we need to base it on three key principles, really. Long-term sustainability over short-term support. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. Provenance over commodity production. And I think, the dysfunctional nature of the food system we have at the moment, driven primarily by large retailers, etc., means that this sort of shift towards that sort of commodity production needs to be reversed. And cooperation over competition. We really need to be building up local food supply systems, cooperative approaches, and not sort of just leave it to the market. And if you don't make food a public good, then you are leaving it to the whims of that market. That's the risk, and you're gifting even more power to the supermarkets, and none of us want to see that. Now, where we probably differentiate in terms of policy mainly is around this sort of talk of a baseline payment or no baseline payment. I think the sector needs at least an element of a baseline payment to give it that stability and security for longer term planning. But the level of that support will need to be reduced compared to what currently is available, because we need to shift that resource into the public goods agenda, and the parameters around those payments as well will need to change. It isn't just about public health, animal health and welfare. We need to use that payment to drive the shift towards more low carbon and high nature value farming. I'm a big fan of the maximum sustainable output model. Some people listening to this morning will know that I've spoken before about the Less is More report that was commissioned by, I think, RSPB, National Trust and Wildlife Trusts. And, it really sort of shatters the myth, and I've seen it myself, with some of the people that I know in the farming industry. If you're struggling, then the default position is we have to create more, we have to produce more, and you're mining the land harder, aren't you? You're working, against the grain of nature, mining that land. When in fact, of course, more inputs, which is required if you want to produce more, increases the cost and gives you relatively lower return, and of course a more degraded environment. So we really need to sort of look at those sort of fundamental principles in terms of basing any baseline payment on them.
And briefly, Llŷr, how do you address that resistance to change, if you like? There is that reticence, isn't there? In some sections of the farming community, we definitely have farmers that are picking up this agenda and running with it, but there's also a lot of resistance to change. How would you tackle that?
Well, not by finding ourselves in probably the space where the relationship between the government of the day and the sector is probably at its worst since devolution. I mean, that's where we are now. If you ask the sector, the shutters come down, frankly, because they have no trust in this government. They have a feeling that they've been let down, that they've been lied to on a number of issues, and it really has shattered that relationship. So we need to reset that relationship. And personally, I think, that myself and Plaid Cymru would be in the best position to rebuild that, because it is a journey we need to travel together. If we're not pulling in the same direction, then it's going to take us longer to get there. Now, that doesn't always mean that you give in to what people ask for, but you really need to have that level of respect, mutual respect, and at the moment it's not there at all.
Diolch. Can I turn to Caroline Jones, please, of the Independent Alliance for Reform Party? Would you support a system prioritising payments for public goods, Caroline? If you could just unmute.
Yeah, I'm just unmuted now, realising. Thank you. First of all, I'd just like to say that following a meeting I had with the Farmers Union members, they were very concerned that they're not being negotiated or spoken to fairly, as Llŷr Griffiths has just alluded to. And you know, you have to bring the farmers on board with you, because we need a sustainable future for our farmers. And when you talk about, when they told me about the costs of the NVZs, you know, of there being a blanket approach instead of a targeted approach, you know, my heart went out to them, because after all, when you're talking about a further investment into their farms of, say, between £80,000 and £150,000, you know, how are you going to go to your bank to get that money when you can't promise any return on it? So I feel that there has to be a better relationship between any future government and the Minister for Agriculture. So we feel that the Common Agricultural Policy has been a disaster for the environment, for food production and for farmers. Production subsidies only benefited factory farming. And I'd like to see a system that rewards farmers for being custodians of nature, rewards them perhaps for protecting our environment and increasing biodiversity. So farmers should be rewarded for planting trees, for maintaining soakways to prevent flooding, and public monies should only be used to provide public benefits rather than supporting intensive practices which have, you know, degraded soil quality and impacted biodiversity. So, you know, we have to look at the organic future of farming, how this can help people to lead better lives than, you know, there's an alternative to takeaway food, which is becoming the norm now for a lot of people, you know, the fast food industry. So we have to, I feel, re-educate people into what the alternative is really. So farming is so important, and you know, we have to reward our farmers and give them the best deal possible to produce rather than not produce.
Thank you, Caroline. Well, turning to Anthony Slaughter from the Wales Green Party, basically, you know, timing and pace of change. Could you address that, please? Is this the right time?
Well, we are coming out of a pandemic, hopefully. And I think that whoever forms the next Welsh government has to really speak with the farmers regarding the time and the pace of the change in going forward. So it is obviously important to, as I said, bring the farmers along with us. And you can only do this by relating to the farmers, by listening to their concerns, and by, you know, mending the bridge that has now, I've seen now from the farming industry and the Welsh government. So time and pace is of great importance, obviously. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in the Wales Green Party representative now, Anthony Slaughter. Would you support a system prioritising payment for public goods? And if you could also address that issue, is this the right time?
Well, the short answer to the first part of the question is yes, but then the devil is in the detail. And you've read my mind really about time and pace. I mean, there's a lot to agree with. We agree with a lot that's been proposed by the Welsh Government, and a lot of previous speakers have said things that we all agree with. But the time is now. We are in an emergency. The nature crisis and the climate emergency have never been more drastic. And we would differ on the scale of timing. For instance, Welsh Government has a target of reaching net carbon zero by 2050. We believe that it needs to be 2030, which is what the science says. So that highlights the need for urgency and how fast we have to move. And looking at farming, I mean, farming is key to this. And I'm really pleased in Wales Green Party, we've been engaging with the farming community a lot in previous years and building relations, because historically there's often been perhaps a sense of mutual mistrust between the two groups. You know, farmers just think we're going to tell them what they should and shouldn't do. We've got people who are very, very anxious about factory farming, but it's turned into a really good relationship, and it's something that really pleases me, because I've always argued that Green Party and farmers always should be on the same side. You know, they're custodians of our landscape and they produce the food we eat. It's so vital. But recognising the urgency of the nature crisis, biodiversity loss, and the climate emergency. And one of the key factors in that is the role that soil has to play in all of this. And that just gives you an indication of how radical change has to be and how fast it has to be. And that is a tricky thing to do. So we're proposing a Green New Deal for farming as part of our wider Green New Deal. And that involves a 10-year transition, a just transition, not leaving people behind, throwing people on the scrap heap, but a just transition to an agroecological system. But that transition has to take everyone with it. It has to be done in consultation with the farmers, communities, and the food movements across Wales. And we believe working together, all wanting the same thing, we could create a much, much more fit for purpose, fit for the 21st century food system for Wales. More opportunities for farmers and growers, more food grown in Wales that's consumed in Wales, more local food chains, more space for nature. All of this is win-win, but we cannot stress enough the urgency needed in this, and that really highlights the need to work together across all sectors to make sure the change happens at the scale and pace needed.
And do you feel the pandemic, in a way, has reconnected people, with local in all kinds of ways? Because we've been living locally, we've been focused locally, and that's translated in many cases to our local high streets, to our local food producers. So, is there an opportunity there?
Definitely, it has made us reconnect with the local and realise what's on our doorstep. But there's a little bit of a bubble going on sometimes. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I'd be having lots of conversations with people and they'd be going, this is showing the way forward. We don't need to drive so much. The roads are empty. There aren't many planes in the sky. But on the other side of that is it's been a very, very tough and challenging 12 months. And a lot of people will want to get back to what they consider business as normal. And on the one hand, we've seen support for local food and local shops. Here where I live in Penarth, there's been a great level of support for local shops and businesses. But on the other hand, we're also seeing a lot of cardboard boxes being dropped off every day from big warehouses. So I think the pandemic has shown us that things can't go on the way they are. It's shown us how fragile our systems are and the flaws in our society. So hopefully it's focused people's minds, and hopefully this goes beyond just being phrases, empty phrases in politicians' mouths. Hopefully we do build back better and think about doing things differently.
Thank you. Well, we are still waiting for Janet Finch-Saunders representing the Conservatives. We will bring her in on this issue when she arrives, but I shall move on now. And I'd just like to turn to biodiversity targets. 2021 will be the crucial year for wildlife, with the United Nations conference this autumn seeking to achieve for threatened wildlife what the Paris Agreement did for climate. Now, will your party support this process by committing to reversing the trend of biodiversity loss by 2030 and introducing legally binding nature recovery targets with regular milestones backed up by monitoring and reporting? If I can switch up the order a little bit and come to you, Rodney, first from the Welsh Liberal Democrats.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Well, I think essentially yes is the answer from the Welsh Liberal Democrats. I mean, we recognise that in addition to the climate crisis, we are very much facing a nature and biodiversity crisis. So we must take an all it takes approach really to reversing the decline of habitats, reversing the decline in biodiversity and wildlife. Environmental pressures, I think, are causing biodiversity declines at rates not previously encountered. I mean, that's the stark reality of it. And the rate of species extinctions we are seeing is sadly accelerating. And also the conditions of our seas and our blue spaces are deteriorating. So we need a combination, we believe, of new legislation and also targeted funded activity to ensure that we leave a thriving, habitable planet fit for future generations. So we would support the calls for legally binding nature recovery targets. Evidence-led targets, we think, are essential if we're going to take the right action in the right places at the right pace to prevent future decline. And that's what it's got to be about. It's about preventing future decline, but also starting to reverse it. So we certainly agree with the WEL proposals to increase the proportion of marine protected areas and conservation zones backed by evidence in order to focus activity and investment on measures that we know will protect and encourage wildlife to thrive.
Thank you for that. If I can turn to Leslie Griffiths, won't we like to hear your views on that whilst we've got you, Leslie? Legally binding nature recovery targets with regular milestones. Basically, we know if something's monitored, it gets done. If you'd just like to respond to that, please.
Okay, thank you. I'm someone who does like targets, but of course, they're only part of the story. So we already have a legal framework around wellbeing that incorporates the resilience of ecosystems. So nature targets, as they develop in the international context, don't just fit well within it, but they already require us to take that globally responsible approach. And obviously, my party will be fully engaged in that process within Wales and internationally. So we already have the SONAR report, which is the most comprehensive assessment of the resilience of nature and our use of natural resources anywhere in the world, and it's part of the legal framework of our Environment Wales Act. We also have the most sophisticated environmental modelling capabilities, certainly in the UK and Europe, in MRAP, so we're in a very strong position to influence the international agenda, as well as develop our own framework further. Leaving the European Union means obviously we've lost the EU environmental governance framework, and we will need new legislation early in the next Senate term to establish a new means of ensuring environmental law functions properly and citizens are able to have access to environmental justice. So this bill, it's already under development. It provides an obvious legislative opportunity to consider how nature targets could then operate in Wales. But I think if we are really determined to make progress, I go back to what I was saying, targets and milestones are only part of the story. You can spend forever gathering data, and natural systems are complicated and changes take place over a very long time. So targets need to be set within a framework of action, and building on the area statements we've been developing, what we're calling nature networks, which is a sort of kind of metro map for Wales's ecosystems, both in terms of natural features themselves, but just as importantly, the people and capabilities that are needed across government, the third sector and businesses to keep those ecosystems in good health. So you need all of these things. You need targets, you need reporting, but you also need that clear sense of purpose and the people you need to deliver it.
Thank you. Caroline Jones, would your party commit to binding targets which are monitored to reverse the decline in nature that we've seen?
Absolutely. I'm a species champion for the Fenraff spider, and visiting the habitat of the spider just brought home to me how vulnerable all of our wildlife are, sadly. I've called on the Welsh Government to adopt legally binding nature targets. The destruction of our environment and the loss of biodiversity is as much of an existential threat to us all as climate change is. So we have to do better, I feel, than the Paris Agreement and ensure that we adopt nature recovery targets that do not allow things to get worse before we start acting. So the targets need to be legally binding and not just on government, but for all of us. And we all have a responsibility. And one thing that really does annoy me is when you go past and you see the machines that the local government put out to lop the trees and so on, and the hedgerows. There are wildlife living in these hedgerows. This is their home, and to just go across with a machine is absolutely dreadful, because you're disturbing nests, you're killing very small animals. And I saw something come out on Facebook the other day, and there were monkeys all shivering, and there were trees being cut down, and it said these weren't just trees, they were our homes. And it does, little messages like that should bring in. So I understand that finance comes into it when you have a machine that's able to do the job of perhaps 10 men. But we have to look at all aspects and how it affects our wildlife. So I really am. This is one thing that annoys both my husband and myself. And I really hope that we can work to reverse this.
Thank you, Caroline. I'd just like to bring in Anthony Slaughter from the Wales Green Party. Where do you stand on the legally binding targets? Clearly, the more wide public, very aware of the climate crisis, but really we're in a nature crisis too.
Apologies. Absolutely. I think there is growing awareness of the nature and biodiversity crisis. And even more importantly, I think there's growing awareness of how interlinked both crises are. One doesn't exist without the other. And it's vital we tackle it, and it needs to be legally enforceable. And ambitious targets are good. We do need very, very ambitious targets. Again, we can't stress the urgency enough. But ambitious targets aren't enough without a real strategy. And in part of our Green New Deal, we're proposing massive expenditure on nature regeneration and habitat restoration. And this has all sorts of knock-on effects. It creates good green jobs, it helps green tourism. So there's all that to take into account. We'd also, I think, stepping up legislation. In our manifesto, we're proposing a Welsh Government Commissioner for Biodiversity and Animal Protection, who would be tasked with this specific role to ensure these targets are missed. These targets are reached, and also strengthen animal welfare laws, both agricultural and wildlife. So it's all, again, the answer to the question is very much a yes, but it's the scale that's needed, the urgency that's needed, and tackling it as soon as the crisis that it is.
Thank you. Lle Griffith, how would Plaid Cymru reverse the nature crisis?
Yeah, well, I've been on a bit of a journey really in terms of targets. I was quite sceptical because we've seen, governments are very good at creating targets, but usually very poor at meeting them. And I think there's also the risk that you create a target and that whole legislative process becomes the obsession rather than driving the change we need to see on the ground. So, we know the climate emergency is well established in the public consciousness, but the parallel crisis in nature, I think, doesn't enjoy the same kind of prominence, and as a result, probably hasn't been afforded the same urgency by government. But we need that sort of game-changing moment now, I think, and I've written recently about the fact that Plaid Cymru in government would introduce a Nature Act, which would do a few things. It would, first of all, formally declare a nature emergency. I mean, I was the one who tabled the motion to declare climate emergency in the Senedd when it was passed 2 years ago. On reflection, maybe naively, I thought everyone would sort of read it as meaning the climate and nature emergency, but that certainly isn't the case. So, our Nature Act would make that explicit as a first thing, but of course, more significantly, the Act would set a statutory duty with those legally binding targets to restore biodiversity in both our terrestrial and marine environments. And the conference, which you referred to, the UN conference, which is happening later this year, that would help frame our targets. But my hope would be that we would aim, for example, to reverse biodiversity decline by 2030 and to see a substantive recovery then in the decades following that. And, we would need to have regular milestones. Otherwise, how do you track progress? And it would have to be backed up by monitoring and reporting for the same reason. So, it's an emphatic yes from Plaid Cymru.
Well, I would like to welcome Janet Finch-Saunders to the panel. Croeso, Janet, I know you've had your jab. I hope you're feeling well. I would just like to give you the opportunity to address the first question the rest of the panel have already spoken on, and that is on farming policy. Would you support a system prioritising payment for public goods? And then perhaps also address how would you reverse the crisis in nature? So good to hear the Conservatives' perspective on this right now.
Yeah, first off, as a party, we endorse the Achieving Net Zero Farming's 2040 goal report and act on its ass. And that means developing future agricultural policy, which provides a commitment to the transition to net zero agriculture with a focus on food productivity. As a group, we remain very clear that environmental protection can only be achieved through policies which have cooperation with the community at heart. It's fair to say Welsh Labour have worked only to betray our farmers by deciding to introduce a Wales-wide nitrates vulnerable zone. And, this could now see our farmers subjected to upfront capital costs of up to £360 million. It could actually see the loss of some farmers income from farming in Wales, and is less than what the actual capital costs of this scheme are going to be. The policy is just a copy and paste of old EU regs, which have demonstrably failed to improve water quality. Instead, the focus should be on supporting farms that need to reduce their agricultural waste. So we would immediately revoke that policy. We would also develop a Welsh policy that places food security and food production at the heart of Welsh Government decision making, as well as enhancing the positive impact farmers already have on the environment through incentivising sustainability. I'm lucky, really. I have a large number of farmers in my constituency, and they see themselves as helping with the environment already, and they are great champions of looking to reduce carbon. And all the way now, they just feel that they're not being supported by government. Welsh Conservatives would reverse that trend and actually, start working with farmers much more collectively, and indeed with the NVZ, working individually with farms if need be. But before introducing regulation, voluntary approaches must be the way forward. At the moment, farmers are feeling that it's always the stick rather than the carrot, and that has to change. If I move on to the question 2 about biodiversity targets, it's fair to say in the 10 years that I've been a member of the Senedd, we've heard about, well, only in the last 2 years out of the 10 years, we've heard about climate emergency. But we also believe that we have a nature emergency. And I've seen very, very little done in the 10 years that I've been a member that it is actually doing anything to address the sort of the retrograde step now. And we're seeing our biodiversity and conservation is not considered a fundamental important element. That would definitely be reversed. We want Wales to be a world leader in protecting our environment, which is why we've consistently called on the Welsh Labour-led government to legislate for ambitious targets, much more ambitious targets to improve nature and biodiversity. We're quite behind. So really the ambitions and targets that have been set are simply not good enough. We need to update our planet.
Briefly, Janet, can I just, let's be clear, do you support payment for public goods?
Yeah, but at the heart of that, there has to be food production and sustainability for our farmers. Going back to the nature and biodiversity, we would bring nature into our towns and cities, helping to reverse biodiversity by implementing an innovative livable cities plan. I don't know if you've seen that. That includes helping and enabling communities to help regenerate neglected or derelict areas into pocket parks. We want to see our urban tree coverage, introducing a charter for trees and ensuring a minimum of 20% urban tree canopy cover by 2030. Welsh Conservatives would introduce a Biodiversity and Natural Environment Act for Wales, establishing ambitious milestones for the restoration of the natural environment, enhancement of biodiversity. We need to educate as well. So I did support.
We're short on time. I think you have caught up there really well. I'd just like to move on to question 3, which I know you will take an interest in. Just let you catch your breath. Taking care of our oceans. Leslie Griffiths, if I can come to you, because I know you've got to switch out shortly. We've missed targets for good environmental status of our seas. What would your Welsh Government do to refresh our approach, and how would you ensure that our marine areas are not left out of any green recovery?
Thank you. Well, the failure across the EU to achieve good environmental status of our seas, I think, is a really good example of what we've just been talking about, how targets by themselves are really not enough. So the target was laudable, but the framework for action in the sense of the Common Fisheries Policy and the UK marine planning more broadly was really looking to maximise the productive potential of the seas, but with insufficient attention being paid to whether that short-term productivity was coming at a long-term cost to the environment. So in government, I published our first Welsh National Marine Plan That sets out our priorities. It includes avoiding the extraction of fossil fuels in our seas. It provides the basis for more deliberate spatial planning in our marine environment. And we want to continue to have productive seas. And we're very keen to see progress in terms of marine energy. And so through marine planning, we want to see productivity and progress with precaution. I see spatial planning, particularly based on our marine plan, to be a very important way of achieving this. I'd also like to see our seas as a core part of our nature networks. That's an important ecosystem, but also a set of people and capabilities that we need to be able to keep our seas in good health going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry I have to leave. Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution, Leslie, and we will turn to John Griffiths for the Labour view in due course, but diolch. I'm turning to Lle'r Griffiths from Plaid Cymru. How do we improve what we're doing around our marine environment at the moment?
Well, I think actually in her answer, Leslie highlighted one problem, because she talked about spatial planning. You look at the spatial planning we've had from the government, and never the twain shall meet when it comes to marine and terrestrial. The National Development Framework is all about the land. There's nothing there about the sea, and we need a much more coherent approach. And I think that reflects a fundamental problem in terms of marine policy in Wales. Because just as the nature emergency is the poor relation to the climate emergency in terms of public awareness and government action, marine is a poor relation to land, given the strong sort of terrestrial focus of government discourse and, maybe more broadly environmental discourse over the years. And if I was minister, then one of the things I would want to try and do is to rebalance that. I met last week with the Marine Conservation Society, and we talked a bit about how we need that sort of mindset shift, that culture change to really strengthen the prominence of our seas in the climate and biodiversity narrative. We really need to see blue recovery alongside, the green recovery. They go hand in hand, don't they? So in terms of marine habitats, I'd like to see priority given to carbon-rich habitats, our seagrass meadows and our coastal salt marshes. There needs to be a real discussion, I think, about the vast amounts of carbon locked up in the seabed. It needs far more protection, and those habitats need better protection. And we would commit to expanding existing habitats either through recovery or by creating new adjacent habitats. Personally, I think there's merit in creating a national park of the sea. In Cardigan Bay, in the Celtic Sea, it's something we really need to investigate. But certainly we need to improve our marine protected areas. We need to extend our marine protected areas, and I can't see why the proposed national forest for Wales should actually extend into the sea as well.
Diolch, Lle'r. Caroline Jones, Independent Alliance for Reform. How do we make sure that the marine environment is not the poor relation?
Well, I think we have to realise that enough is enough, and our seas are not an alternative to landfill. As an island nation, our seas are as integral to our environment as our mountains, our forests, or our valleys. The target has already been missed for 2020. So the region that I was elected to represents the home of many important species of marine life, and some of the best beaches in the world between Porthcawl, Gower. So clean seas are as vital as clean air, and this disparity has to be rebalanced and addressed. Yet we continue to allow untreated effluent to flow into our seas, So we allow the dredging of aggregates and the dumping of potentially radioactive waste. So like I said in the beginning, our seas are not an alternative to landfill. So we have to realise this, and, we have to take the public along with us, as well as governments making decisions to use our seas as a dumping ground. It's got to stop, and you are affecting all the marine life, and the two have to go hand in hand. It's all of the environment, including the seas, and not just the marine life left out of the equation. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Anthony Slaughter from the Wales Green Party. how do we make sure in terms of renewables in the marine environment that is not to the detriment of biodiversity, that we want to win on the energy front, but we don't want to have a negative impact in other ways?
Very good question. I mean, people have touched on spatial planning, and we believe that marine spatial planning really does need to be adapted in a meaningful way in Wales. And that has to look at all the uses, all the users and all the uses of our marine environment, including, you're absolutely right to touch on renewables. We need holistic planning. We need to see things in the whole, which is what the Green Party always do. And we have to look at the impact of everything we do and measure it, okay, the impact on other users as well. And it comes back to recognizing, I think people have touched on, recognizing that the marine environment is as crucial as our terrestrial environment, and giving it equal importance in policy making. We'd also support a lot of rewilding of our marine environment, and Claire's touched on the seagrass meadows. We'd like to see restoration of seagrass meadows in Wales. And we need to look at things like deep sea trawling. We need to stop that. We need to extend marine protected areas. Again, it comes back to targets, but targets being implemented effectively and urgently.
Anthony, thank you. If I can turn to Councillor Rodney Berman from the Welsh Liberal Democrats, it's not just what we need to be doing, additional things, but it's also what we need to stop doing. How do we protect our marine environment in that way?
Well, I think, we do have to look at our legacy, and, other candidates have talked about, what historically we've been dumping into the sea, and that certainly has to be part of the equation. How can we improve that? I mean, it's been interesting during these days of lockdown that we've been through in the last year, and one of the places that I have explored, as we've only been able to take local walks, which I'd never been to before, was the infamous Splot Beach. And I don't know if anybody's ever been to the lovely Splot Beach on the edge of Cardiff. I mean, it's not really a beach, to be quite honest, but what you do see there is just, the impact of our industrial legacy, and the amount of waste that's around, the aromas you get from what's going into the sea as well. So you realise that, we do have a legacy to undo. Now, as Welsh Liberal Democrats, we are concerned that, having departed from the EU, it does leave us to a certain extent unprepared and ill-equipped to take the necessary action. I know there may well have been failings with what the EU was doing, but it's easier to tackle these kind of issues together with other nations than it is to try to tackle them in isolation. But nonetheless, that's where we are. So we do need to consider what new legislation and approaches are needed that we can take here, what evidence is required, and also how can we ensure regular ongoing monitoring and reporting. And I think that's also been touched upon. We do need to make sure that the Welsh Government is held to account on targets. So we may have had reasonable targets put in place, but if they haven't been achieved, then that isn't basically dealing with the problem. So we've got to make sure that we have properly evidence-based targets, that they're suitably informed by experts and practitioners. We also need to make sure that they are taken seriously and that we do work to meet them. So we need some kind of accountability framework put in place that will force action if we're not meeting those targets. Because after all, this is about the future of our planet. So one of the things we will do would be to publish nature and marine recovery plans. And the idea is to clean up our environment, our waters, protect species and wildlife, and ensure that green and blue spaces can thrive. So what we need to do to achieve that is we need to identify short, medium, and long-term actions. And that should include what, if any, legislation or regulations are needed. So we need to make sure, as I say, we do this thoroughly, that we put the relevant regulations and legislation in place, but also, it's something I learned from my time in local government. You can have all the fine policies you want, but unless you actually target the funding that's needed to deliver things, you don't always deliver. So we've got to make sure that any framework, any legislation, any regulations we put in place are also backed up by the necessary funding to ensure that we can deliver the results we want and that we can turn this around.
Thank you. Turning to Janet Finch-Saunders, a lot of support there for targets, but it's about the actions, isn't it, to meet those targets? How do we do that in a marine environment context?
Well, I think we could look to the UK, really. If you look at 38% of UK waters They're in marine protected areas. I'm very keen on our marine environment. I'm the harbour porpoise champion. And I'm pleased that the UK now has 357 marine protected areas of different types, and it's spanning 220,000 square kilometres. So, you know, we could do a lot worse than look as to how they value our marine environment. I'm also pleased that Conservative UK government ministers have also stated their intention to pilot highly protected marine areas in our waters. This once again underlines that on an issue of this magnitude and importance, we should be working with our UK partners. You know, as firm unionists, the Welsh Conservatives would look to maintain this positive partnership. We would also work with stakeholders to deliver a new fishing strategy for Wales, which will be based on the principle of maximum sustainable yield. We would also place a legal duty on the Welsh Government to maintain fish sustainability for every stock. We are, you know, working towards creating a £150 million Wales Marine Energy Investment Fund. So Wales is at the forefront of developments in clean energy, taking in marine spatial considerations to ensure that our shores are not oversaturated, and always being mindful of our conservation duties. One thing that I'm, you know, concerned about, we quite often see though, when we're looking to put renewable energy in place with wind turbines, sometimes like North Wales, it's well known there's going to be an over proliferation of those, but the damage to our marine environment must be part and parcel of any planning going forward to allow these wind turbines, because we know that from previous schemes we have seen reduction of a lot of our species. So we have to ensure that there is, you know, support for our marine, you know, some protected areas to offset when big, you know, large wind farm schemes are introduced, because it is a fact that they do, you know, the disturbance to the seabed, you know, there has to be some recompense for that.
Janice, I just want to move on, just a brief answer, please, if you would, on plastic pollution. You know, Wales's ability, you know, to make its own path and policy, I mean, obviously can be hampered by that internal markets bill. So, you know, plastics, very, very, very important to our environment and also to the public, you know, a high level of awareness there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do numerous beach cleans with the Marine Conservation Society. And just recently we found that 55.9% of 218 items picked up were made of either plastic or polystyrene. And we just, you know, I tabled legislation this year calling for the introduction of a deposit return scheme. We've been talking about that since I've been a member of the Senedd, and the government have done nothing. So my proposal sought to reduce the number of single-use plastic and glass bottles. Estimates currently are that 77% of glass bottles, 66% of aluminium cans, and 65% of plastic drink bottles are recycled. And when we've raised this in committee, the minister has, you know, laudably said about the amount recycled, but there's still an awful lot of plastic, microplastics, making their way into the marine environment.
Thank you. If I'd like to bring in John Griffiths there on that. Plastics, in many ways, the public, you know, perhaps the public are ahead of the politicians on this one.
Thank you very much, Carol. I think the first thing to say is that thankfully Wales is in a real position of strength as far as recycling is concerned. You know, we're one of the world leaders now, and that's such a great position for our country to be in. And that's been achieved really through a strong lead from Welsh Government, working with local government, working with the third sector, and of course very much working with communities.
But so we know recycling's not enough. It's got to be about reducing altogether. You know, recycling is just the very beginning of, you know, a circular economy, isn't it? We've got to do better than recycling.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, the first strand of the waste hierarchy obviously is to reduce, but what we need is that approach that's delivered on recycling. We need government at different levels working with communities and working with business. As far as reduce is concerned, if we get back into government in Wales following the elections, we will introduce reuse and repair hubs in our town centres. And I think that's going to be a really important signal in terms of working with our communities, and we're going to see hopefully a further cultural shift around that. But yes, it is very much about reducing the amount of waste we produce, and these hubs will enable that to happen, and they should have a lasting positive legacy over a long term rather than just being a short-term measure. But in order to help that cultural shift, I do think, you know, we need to use legislative tools, and we want to see a series of measures in regulations as well, which would introduce outright bans on any item where there is evidence of harm to the environment and where more sustainable alternatives exist. So we could start with the 9 most commonly littered items and then work through other items in that, you know, that sort of context that create that sort of harm. We think there are around 60 items that constitute the problem. So we'll be looking for evidence to see what we should legislate against, and again, taking communities and business with us. In terms of business, Carol, I think we all know that we need more responsibility from producers. So we want to see a much more robust system of extended producer responsibility. So companies themselves bear the cost of the waste that their products generate. And we want to give them a much stronger incentive to find more sustainable options. You know, locally in Newport, I've worked with businesses, fast food outlets, for example, and, you know, they cooperated to a certain extent, and we put schemes in place to deal with the waste that their premises result in. But it's just not enough. You know, we need a lot more, and that's why we need to drive forward that producer responsibility. So, you know, just in essence, we do need everybody to step up to the plate. We've done great things in Wales, but yes, we do need to do a lot more. And it's about government at all levels, business and communities and voluntary sector working together.
Thank you, John. If I can turn to the Wales Green Party, Anthony, how would your party create a truly circular economy and prevent, you know, material being used unnecessarily? Anthony, could you just unmute, please?
After 12 months, you think I'd be used to this. Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head there, really. I mean, it might sound contentious to say, but recycling is a failure. It's great that we're leading the way in recycling, but the fact that we're recycling so much isn't a success in itself. A genuine circular economy, it has to be about reuse and reduce. We need legislation with teeth. We need to, if we're going to, you know, Wales has joined the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, we need to get legislation that actually backs it up for a genuine circular economy. And I think you're right, you said earlier about our communities perhaps leading the way on this. I mean, I helped coordinate the campaign here in Penarth to get plastic-free community status for the Surface Against Sewage campaign. And there's a real appetite, there's a real hunger amongst the public to do something about this problem, you know, because they recognise the scale of the crisis. And it is great that that community level engagement happens, but that's not going to fix the problem. I mean, we need to ban all single-use plastics, and we need to even go further. And John's right to talk about producer responsibility. You buy something from a shop and you look at it, you're sorting out your recycling, and you look at it and it says, this is not currently recyclable. Then why is it allowed to be produced? It really is that simple. We need to stop this at source. And we need to look at things like legislation on the right to repair, ironically being brought in by the EU now that we're no longer in there, and legislation against built-in obsolescence. We need to stop being such a throwaway society, and it needs legislation and government to lead the way on that.
Thank you. Llyr Griffiths, how would Plaid Cymru stop us being that throwaway society and pick up the pace of change, which is clearly what the environment and nature need?
Indeed, we need to pick up the pace of change. You're absolutely right. And, you know, it isn't so much what other parties would be doing. I think the question we should be asking is, what should the Welsh Government already have done? You know, I've been a member of the Senate since 2011, and Labour have been talking since then about banning plastics and deposit return schemes. And 10 years and 2 Labour governments later, we're still waiting. So we absolutely need to ramp up the level of interventions here. I mean, the Plaid Cymru government would immediately ban non-essential single-use plastics. You know, plastic bags, straws, cutlery, styrofoam. You know, we know the damage they're causing, so why are we still tolerating their use? we need to make companies that produce packaging financially responsible, as already been said, the extended producer responsibility. We need to introduce a deposit return scheme. Crikey, we've been talking about it long enough. We would introduce a levy on single-use cups, to encourage reusable alternatives. Zero waste going to landfill no later than 2025, yes, but I want to end all waste incineration as well. And we need to be increasing the statutory target for recycling municipal waste. We need to be adding more material to the list of what we can recycle. We need to set new ambitious targets for commercial and industrial waste as well. And I want to see particularly binding targets to halve food waste from farm to fork by 2030. And as Anthony said, we really need to be going beyond recycling and bringing about that truly circular economy we all want to see in Wales. And that urgency, Labour are going into this election promising once more that they will take action on plastics. And, whether they choose to blame COVID, I don't know, but they really can't use the last 12 months to excuse their inaction over the last 10 years.
Diolch Llyr. Rodney, how would the Welsh Liberal Democrats create a truly circular economy and go beyond recycling? Because clearly that's not enough.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. And certainly from my time in local government as leader of Cardiff Council, we did our bit to massively increase the city's recycling rate. But it's got to be much more than that. We've also got to be looking, wholeheartedly at how do we reduce waste being created in the first place, and that's fundamentally got to be part of the approach. So the principle of the circular economy is something that we've very much got to embrace. We need to have a systematic approach to economic development that's designed to benefit businesses, society, and the environment. So, I suppose the questions that we've got to grapple is how can we design out waste and pollution? And we would want to do that starting with the public sector, where we perhaps can have most control over the levers. I'll look at how we can get, waste minimisation, much more on the agenda. And one of the things we'd bring forward would be a People's Procurement Act, and that would prioritise local supply chains and local businesses, and it'd also be underpinned very much by the principles of a circular economy. We also do need to progress plans for a national deposits return scheme, and that may have to include financial support for providers. But I think Llyr is right there. We can't just be talking about these things. We've actually got to deliver them. We also need to support a network of reuse centres across Wales, including community-led initiatives. We hear about things like libraries of things being set up, but those are the sort of initiatives that we need to take forward. We need to find ways where people can just think of disposing of something as the last resort. It's how it can be reused first, how it can be repurposed, how it can be given another home and another life. I think that's got to be much more to the fore in how we look at disposing of things. And we certainly do need to accelerate in ending single-use plastics. So we would investigate and set a firm end date for that here in Wales. And we'd also ensure that concerns around equality matters are addressed and accounted for. I think, as I said earlier, one of the key things that we would want to do is start with the public sector, where perhaps the Welsh Government has more control. Use that to really drive this whole agenda forward, and hopefully create momentum that can then, spiral onwards.
Thank you very much for that. So starting with the public sector, things that there is more control over. Caroline Jones, Independent Alliance for Reform. What would your party do to end plastic pollution in Wales?
Thank you, Carol. And we know that the explosion in single-use plastics in recent decades has been one of the biggest contributors to our pollution epidemic. Wales was a pioneer in reducing single-use carrier bags, and we have some of the best recycling rates worldwide, and yet we still face a plastic menace. So I'd like to see the next Welsh Government work with the UK government and governments across the UK. But first of all, I have to say that I would like a more mature relationship, whoever forms the next Welsh Government, to what there is now with the UK governments, because unless we all work together on this with a positive relationship, we are never going to achieve. So I want a mature relationship from the next Welsh Government, please, with regarding the UK government. And I want the governments across the UK to place stringent controls on packaging waste. the focus has to be on reducing waste and not just recycling it. So however, you know, we should also encourage innovations in the reuse of the mountains of plastic waste generated on a weekly basis. For example, plastic bottles can be turned into fabric or even building insulations. We should incentivize R&D into such inventions and look at ways that we can continually recycle such materials. We are all in this together, the UK, us, everywhere else in the world. So good relationship, please, is one of the requirements I think is necessary to achieve.
Thank you, Caroline, for that. I've got a good eye on the clock here, and I do want to address this issue of the governance gap after leaving the EU. So if I can just invite you all in your answers just to be tight and bright, just to keep us on time. Turning to you, Janet Finch-Saunders, how would you address that governance gap in Wales now we've left the EU? Janet, if you could unmute your mic, please. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. So the timeline for the establishment of a permanent successor environmental governance body for Wales does remain unclear. And I know we've presented some robust scrutiny to the Minister over the past few months about this. I'm pretty nervous that the Welsh Government's response seems now to be set on the course of addressing gaps as they arise, and that's certainly not good enough. The interim measures enacted by Welsh Labour are deeply concerning, especially relegating transparency and scrutiny powers of the Senedd and preventing people from pursuing concerns. It's certainly progress to see that Welsh Labour have finally accepted that Wales must introduce an independent environmental watchdog, but we've had to robustly make calls for this. You know,
would you support polluter pays? Would you support legislation for polluter pays?
Absolutely, yes, yeah. You know, Welsh, you know, we must have an independent environmental watchdog. You know, this issue just keeps literally being kicked into the long grass. A Welsh Conservative government would also take the opportunity to call time on Natural Resources Wales, because it has been besieged by, you know, incompetence.
What would you replace it with?
Well, you know, I think it just, you know, you'd actually have, at the moment, they are trying to deal with issues such as flooding, protecting the environment, forestry, and by their own admission alone, they would need 70 more officers working for them just to deal with flooding. So it definitely you need an environmental body that actually does what it's supposed to do. And currently now, I worry really, because I do think that Natural Resources Wales, they're just overstretched, and they're having to fall short now in their you know, sort of their own ambitions. We would also ensure that government departments and organisations are delivering value for money for the taxpayer, taking this opportunity. We need to reset our environmental protections, our regulations and maintenance of nature resources throughout Wales. I think it's fair to say that...
How difficult is that for you to balance, though, when you say Natural Resources Wales, you know, they don't have enough officers to do what you think they should be doing, but at the same time, you've got to look at, you know, value for money. You know, it's going to cost more to have more capacity. Yet at the same time, there's a sense that perhaps these, you know, arm's length government organisations, you know, traditionally Conservatives would say, you know, perhaps are unwieldy and not value for money. Where's the balance on that?
Well, look how overstretched Natural Resources Wales already are, and yet now they brought the All Wales Nitrate Vulnerable Zones, you know, legislation forward. That's going to place even more responsibility and burden on NRW in terms of enforcement. So, you know, really, we need a genuine, independent, standalone body that actually is able to cover all the aspects that NRW are trying to. They're juggling at the moment such as the workload and balance that they have, and there's simply not enough resources going into them to be able to succeed. So the whole thing needs looking at.
John Griffiths, the whole thing needs looking at. How do we fill that governance gap now we've left the EU?
Well, I think we start from the premise that we need to put all 4 of the EU environmental principles into Welsh law, and they have to apply to the policy making process. And that would be very much in line with the duties on public bodies under the Environment Wales Act. Every public body and every government department needs to take a role in responding to climate change, the climate emergency, and the emergency that our nature faces. So those broad principles need to apply right across the board, and that's what we need to ensure. So we are committed then in the Labour Party to delivering an environmental principles and governance bill as early as possible in the next Senedd term, should we be returned to government. And the priority for us will be to work with civil society and our existing regulators and commissioners in Wales, so that we make this an integral part of our democratic process. So that's working with the Senedd, with the Wales Audit Office, with the Future Generations Commissioner, as well as civil society and the wider public. We found, I think, when we were in the European Union, that taking up concerns with the European Commission enabled us to have access to a level of capacity and expertise that will be really hard to replace. But it's probably also true to say that it was often a complex and lengthy process and not really connected with Welsh institutions. So what we want to see in putting in place a new governance system in Wales is more than just filling the gap that's been created, but building something new and stronger, which can handle public concerns and put public bodies back on the right track when things go wrong, but also helping to develop our public institutions more broadly, so they all become better, more adept at embodying environmental principles in everything they do. Basically, I think that's the challenge, but obviously it's also a real opportunity.
Thank you for that, John. Llŷr, how do we fill that environmental governance gap?
Well, frankly, there shouldn't be a gap. Many of us were warning the Welsh Government years ago that they needed to get their act together on this, and they didn't listen. And what we have now, of course, is a half-cocked, face-saving fix that they've cobbled together to patch up that gap. I mentioned our Nature Act earlier. I mean, we would use that act to create an independent environmental governance body for Wales. And in relation to, you were asking about the polluter pays principle. I was a strong Remainer in the EU referendum campaign, and one of the reasons for that was, of course, that I didn't want Wales to be rowing back on environmental standards. And I have to say, I'm surprised that Janet is sort of conflating Natural Resources Wales with an environmental governance body. They're 2 very different things. And to suggest that she'd want to scrap NRW, I think, is quite a shock, because in fairness, they've seen a 35% cut in their funding in real terms since 2013. Now, that's partly because the Welsh Government, of course, are pulling the purse strings, but it's driven primarily by the UK Tory government's austerity agenda.
Diolch, Llŷr. And just moving on to Caroline Jones of the Independent Alliance for Reform. We've got an environmental governance gap. How would your party fill it? Caroline, if you could unmute. Thank you.
Just unmuted, thanks. First of all, thank you, Carol. I am a firm believer in that the polluter pays, because we cannot keep passing the buck and shipping our waste overseas. Environmental protection should be a top priority of government, and it should run across all of the portfolios. So there's no reason why we cannot have some of the most stringent environmental protections in the world. We just have to show leadership. However, we do need to be able to hold governments to account when they fail to protect our environment. And I hope that the Supreme Court will be an effective deterrent to governments who are shirking their responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Turning to the Welsh Liberal Democrats, Rodney Berman, would you make it a top priority, the environmental government gap, as a first piece of legislation of a Welsh government?
Well, I'm not sure if we would make it, a first piece of legislation. I mean, we've got policies such as, bringing forward a Clean Air Act within 100 days, and that's something that it would be a clear priority for us. But we do need to look towards establishing a new independent body that's going to hold the Welsh Government to account and ensure compliance with policy and practice. Obviously, there is a gap now that we've left the EU. And the other thing we'd like to do is we'd like to work with partners to identify the necessary resources for both Welsh Government and local authorities so that we can deliver on our aspirations for the planet. So let's look at a partnership approach, but also let's look at having the relevant regulatory body that can ensure that we have the appropriate governance in place.
Thank you for that, and thank you for your brevity, because I do want to get into closing statements from all the parties here, but I'd also just perhaps like to frame it in terms of, thinking in terms of, young people and the public more generally. Are the politicians lagging behind the public in some of these issues? Have you as politicians got catching up to do in terms of, the environment, particularly where young people are concerned? And of course, those younger people will be voting this time around. So I'm going to be strict on a minute, everybody, so please respect that. And I'd like to go to Janet Finch-Saunders of the Conservative Party first for your minute closing statement, please.
Thank you. Well, it's fair to say that Welsh Labour again have shown a complete lack of leadership and ambition in tackling Wales's contribution to climate change and our nature emergency. I'm also concerned to see that very little within the budget 2021 to 22 supports the potential for a green recovery or a blue recovery. We hear of green recovery, green jobs, green economy. We do not hear about blue recovery, blue jobs and blue economy, which is, so important in terms of our marine environment. Clean air has seen a real terms cut, and support for private hydro has been scrapped, making many schemes unviable. And in contrast, the Welsh Conservatives would take a leadership role. We would ensure that legislation supports the aspiration to reach net zero agriculture emissions by 2040. We'd back young people and the environment by giving all 16 to 24-year-olds a green card, which would provide free bus travel and a third off rail travel. Today, in our plan to help Wales bounce back better, we've announced that 15,000 new green jobs will be created to help make Wales the green capital of the world. And we'd also establish a green home grant scheme to help low-income households to make energy efficiencies in their homes and provide work opportunities to tradespeople. We've spearheaded calls for a DRS scheme, commit to implementing a Clean Air Act within 100 days, and would convene an emergency green economic summit. The Welsh Conservatives... Okay.
Thank you for that, Janet. That's great. I turn to Anthony Slaughter of the Wales Green Party.
Thanks. Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Oh, sorry. It's been a really interesting conversation, and it's quite good hearing so much common ground. I mean, years ago, on these debates, there'd be people there arguing that there wasn't a problem. So it's good to see the discussion shifting onto stuff that we've been talking about for decades now in the Green Party. And we've talked a lot about targets and ambition. What we need in the Welsh Senedd and the Welsh Parliament is scrutiny. We need a green voice in that room, holding well-meaning politicians to account and making sure they deliver. Well-meaning government isn't enough to deliver well-being. If you want people who care and understand this issue and the urgency of this issue, you need Greens in the Senedd. And we can get elected in the Senedd. So when you're voting on the regional list, just seriously think, who do you want holding the next Welsh Government to account on these vital issues?
Thank you for that, Anthony. Turning to Caroline Jones of the Independent Alliance for Reform Party.
Thank you. The next Welsh Government, I feel, needs to be able to build relationships and increase their activity on the relationships they've already built with all partners regarding our environment, so that we have a greener economy. We need to set targets, but they have to be realistic targets. We need to bring the public along with us, as well as the farmers. We need to give incentives to the farmers to produce the organic fruit and the organic veg that they are capable of doing. And I say this because it's very important that we have one of the highest obesity rates recently recorded. So we need to work with people from poorer families to be able to afford organic goods, that it's not just simply that they're out of reach for everybody. So I want a healthy relationship. I want a partnership that works all together to increase green jobs. Travelling is also important. Incentives to purchase electric cars, more than it is now. The £3,000 doesn't go anywhere near to helping a greener economy and reducing carbon emissions.
Thank you, Caroline. Moving on to the Welsh Liberal Democrats, Rodney Berman, your final statement, please.
All right. Yeah. Okay. I think the issue here is that we do need to put tackling the climate change and tackling the nature crisis, more to the fore going forward. So in that extent, we have to reflect that the fact there is much more desire for more to be done there. And we certainly we put that front and foremost, because what we want to do is create a Wales Emergency Green Recovery Package. And that would commit the Welsh Government to an annual spend of £1 billion on environmental measures. Some of that would be public money, some of that would be private money. And it's got to be focusing on measures to stop the climate breakdown and also tackle the decline in biodiversity. It's about putting the environment right at the heart of the economic recovery that we're going to have to see. The next Senedd term is going to be about tackling COVID, recovery from COVID, but also resetting society and building it in a more environmentally sustainable manner. So giving it that absolute top priority, putting it absolutely front and central to our programme, is what you'll get if the Liberal Democrats are a part of the running of the Senedd after the elections.
Diolch, Rodney. Llyr Griffith from Plaid Cymru.
Well, this decade is absolutely huge in our fight against the climate and nature crisis. The same bumbling along approach just isn't going to cut it anymore. So the next government has to be one with new vigour and new determination, and quite frankly, a bloody mindedness that we haven't seen to date. At the last election, Labour promised a Clean Air Act, a ban on plastics, stronger energy efficiency. We're still waiting. And now they're promising us all of that again. This is the fork in the road. This is the moment where we all have to decide, is our current trajectory on the climate and nature crisis good enough? Now, I say it isn't, and that's why Plaid Cymru and government will commit to Wales reaching net zero carbon emissions, not by 2050, but by 2035. And that's why our Nature Act will introduce statutory targets for biodiversity recovery and an independent environmental governance body for Wales. So the choice is clear. If you're happy with the status quo, then vote for the status quo. But if you want change, vote for Plaid Cymru.
Diolch, Llyr. Turning to John Griffiths, the representative from Welsh Labour.
Yes, well, we've made real progress in Wales in tackling our environmental challenges, but as ever, there's much more to do, and we need to build on the progress that we've made. During the pandemic, we've seen a new appreciation of nature, of green space, of clean air, of our local parks, and we need to build on that. Young people are very concerned with these environmental issues, and we've seen organisations like Extinction Rebellion really drive home messages and put this on the public agenda, and we need to capitalise on that cultural shift and make sure we take our communities with us. We see other parties in the Senedd shying away from dealing with agricultural pollution, whereas Welsh Labour is serious about that and will tackle it effectively. We need legislation, but we need communities, business, the third sector, government at all levels to deal with these challenges. The challenge is to build back better, as we know, through and beyond the pandemic, but also to build back more equally and greener. And that's just what a future Welsh Government in the Senedd will do.
Diolch, thank you to all our panelists, and I wish you all a safe and effective campaign time as we come into that. And I would just like to thank everybody as well for joining us on YouTube today for this session. Don't forget to register to vote by post or in person by April the 19th. And also don't forget, this time around, 16 and 17-year-olds can vote for the very first time. And of course, we do know that the environment, nature and climate is very important to that group of the population. So thank you to WEL for hosting this hustings and for the invitation to chair. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to say that we're supposed to have our chair come back in and join us, but he's just in the waiting room. So yeah, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Carol, for chairing. We really appreciate it. Please go about your days and go back to the campaign. I hear that the campaign is headed in full force now, but a big thank you to Carol from ITV Wales. I know that there's a lot of news going on right now, and a big thank you to Janet for joining us, even though she had a vaccine appointment at the same time. I'll let the candidates go, but Roger's just going to have a look at the YouTube comments in a discussion and read out some of the most common comments, but the candidates should all feel free to dial off. I'm going to spotlight Roger now.
So much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
You're right there, Roger?
I'm here. That was interesting. And I suppose not surprising that in the chat, the majority of the comments are about farming, given that Wales is 80% agricultural land. So, yeah. But yeah, lots of interesting things. I'm going to have to read for an iPad because I don't seem to be able to connect both.
That's okay. While you're loading up the YouTube, I can read out some of the comments from the Twitter. If anyone is still viewing, then SenedNatur21 is the hashtag we've been using. And I think something that we didn't manage to mention much, but we wanted to, was that the green recovery is really key to all this. There's so much to talk about on the environment, but a lot of what we're talking about is a green recovery out of the pandemic, and a lot of comments around Twitter have been about starting afresh and doing things differently.
I'd just like to add, whilst Roger,
as Carol said at the end, sort of emphasise.
I would just like to add, ITV Cymru Wales, obviously we, like everybody, you know, COVID has been our main focus, but climate and nature very much on our agenda as well. So I know that a lot of bodies represented at this hustings today in terms of the audience. So do get in touch with me or wales@itv.com. We are interested in this agenda, particularly as we head into the autumn and you know, the summit. So you know, do keep in touch. You can contact me, you know, via Twitter or via email and in all the usual ways. Diolch.
Right. Okay. Well, looking at the chat, then I said there were a lot of them on agriculture, and I suppose one of the early ones that struck me was a comment from James Byrne about the fact that air pollution in Wales is from agriculture is a major ecological issue, and you know, shouldn't this be part of the Clean Air Act? Another one, another comment was about legislation helping to provide connectivity, because connectivity clearly is what we need to join up our wildlife, you know, to actually connect those oases that we have of good wildlife with the rest of Wales, and to connect them up. We need to have connectivity and wider landscaping within the sustainable farming scheme. We had some comments on food, on getting small farms to create co-ops to build their power to stand up to the supermarkets. And looking further down, there was a comment that Plaid Cymru seems to be the only party that is going to support the status quo, the basic payment scheme, which, as a number of you have commented, has led us to where we are now, unsustainable farms and serious nature degradation.
A lot of discussion around farming, agricultural pollution regulations, and how we need to take a very different approach to farming. And this is after all opportunity to replace common agriculture policy. So lots of that on YouTube. Over on Twitter, there was some discussion over how we make the nature and climate emergency equal and how we treat them equally. I think we heard Clea say he assumed that when we declared a climate emergency, that was of course including nature. It's perhaps a matter of semantics more than anything else. But it's something that Wales Environment Link has been profusely pushing, that we need to make sure nature's at the heart of all these policies. And as Roger said at the beginning, when you take action to fix nature, you're often taking action to fix climate without even trying. When you take action to fix climate, you don't necessarily restore nature. So there's been a lot of discussion around that too. Anything else from you, Roger, on YouTube?
Yes, I think local food strategies, another thing that came up, and then moving on, there's also quite a lot of discussion, comment about developments. It started with a comment about the proposed Deeside Corridor Red Route, which is enormously destructive to biodiversity. But then a whole series of developments in Cardiff which seem to have been ignored in terms of their biodiversity impacts. One commenter saying that in fact ecocide was being committed across Cardiff City, and a comment that the reason for this is because local authorities aren't being held to account, aren't being chased to enforce the requirements that government puts in legislation. So I thought that was very, very pertinent to today's discussion. And then on
Absolutely.
biodiversity loss, the fact that the COVID and climate crises are being treated as crises, but biodiversity remains lagging behind. Nature is still not treated as a crisis.
Just going to, sorry, go on.
Yeah, and I was going to say there was also a call for candidates to explain how we will enable and equip communities to help protect their local environments.
Yeah, and I think there's been some things on Beyond on Twitter particularly highlighted the quote from Carol Green herself saying recycling's not enough, we need to do better than recycling. I think instead of talking perhaps in the last election, we would have talked more about recycling targets. In this election, people were talking about deposit return schemes and reducing waste from the point of source rather than just increasing recycling targets. Yes,
I often think that we had reuse, recycle, and then we had reduce, reuse, recycle, but we need to have refuse, reduce, recycle. Yeah,
refuse the packaging.
All the packaging in the first place, and we have seen that being quite effective in some places where people have unpacked their goods at the checkout and left the packaging behind, and that's actually led to some action.
That's enforcing extenders producer responsibility. You have to reduce their own waste because you're leaving it on the conveyor belts. I think that's most of what was discussed. Is there anything else?
I thought, there was some discussion on marine, not as much as I thought might have come out from the candidates. And I think it's pretty clear to me that we're still not doing enough for our marine environment in Wales. And we need all our political parties to actually step up and address this much more comprehensively and effectively. And then obviously there was quite a big discussion on environmental governance as well.
I think having the Plaid Cymru did announce their Nature Act this morning. It's an interesting policy. It was very good to have that mentioned, and how they said about targets covering land and sea. I'm not sure we really drilled down into, although they were all pretty supportive of nature targets. I think Wales Environment Link would certainly want to see them covering the sea as well, because as you say, marine is very easy to ignore. It's after all many miles away offshore.
Yeah, it's the biggest part of Wales as well.
Exactly, isn't it a third part larger than the size of Wales? I forget this. Yeah. We certainly have the biggest coastline out of this island. All right, well, Roger, if there's anything more from you, I'll close up the session. I can't see any more comments on YouTube.
I think we're there.
Saying it's encouraging to see representatives from all parties showing awareness of the range of issues and the enthusiasm to address them. That's a very good point, Cleanos. We need to make sure this is a cross-party basis, and that's why we were delighted to host this hustings today. Nature is a cross-party issue. Nobody owns nature and nature doesn't own us, but we know that we all need to revive it and we need to restore it. And in Wales, we've got it on our back door so we can see how important it is. So, Roger, I'll hand it over to you to wrap up. Can you remind people to register to vote?
Yeah, well, hopefully everybody is registered to vote, but more than that, I hope everybody's encouraging their younger members of the family who are voting for the first time, or people they know who are coming in to vote for the first time, schools they're connected with, who have pupils who are voting for the first time. Get them to vote, because we know that young people are much more concerned about nature than the majority of the population. So please get them to vote. And and otherwise, no, it's just diolch I chi gyd am ymuno â ni bore 'ma. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning, and please keep pressing your candidates.
Absolutely, yes, and make sure you're registered to vote, or change to a postal vote if you're isolating at home, or if the pandemic prevents you getting your polling station. It's the 19th of April you need to do it by. Encourage everyone, 16, 17-year-olds, everyone to vote. Right, I will stop the live stream there. Thank you so much, Roger, for hosting. And everyone vote Thursday the 6th of